In a brightly lit TV studio, with millions watching and cameras capturing every angle, Jasmine Crockett thought she was here to reflect on her career, until Steve Harvey said one unexpected thing that brought her entire world to a standstill. Behind her calm smile was a past full of betrayal, exhaustion, and a night she nearly gave up for good. But years ago, a video clip from Steve, just a few words spoken in faith, became the reason she chose to live another day. Two strangers, one forgotten sentence. What did Steve Harvey say that unknowingly pulled someone back from their darkest hour? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The studio lights pulse like a heartbeat, soft, golden, reverent, casting a halo over the polished floor of the stage. The audience had come expecting warmth, laughter, and maybe a few anecdotes about Capitol Hill politics. What they didn't expect was the storm quietly approaching in high heels. Steve Harvey stepped forward with his signature half-smile, but tonight his voice carried more weight. She's been called a disruptor, a troublemaker, even too loud for Congress, he said, pausing. But I call her what she truly is, a warrior for justice in a battlefield that was never built to protect her. Applause erupted, but Jasmine Crockett didn't soak it in. She walked out steady, poised, eyes sharp as glass. Her tailored navy blazer whispered authority, but the quiet strain beneath her smile told a different story. Of battles waged behind closed doors, of rooms where her voice was silenced before she ever opened her mouth. The kind of injustice that doesn't leave bruises on the skin, but carves deep fractures into the soul. She took her seat, but not before her eyes locked onto the small, silver crucifix hanging from Steve's neck. And just like that, something inside her shifted. Her breath caught, not visibly, but internally, like someone stepping on a landmine of memory. For a split second, her mind wasn't in the studio. It was in the backseat of a car parked outside the Capitol, fists clenched around a crumpled folder marked "Motion Denied." It was in the echo of a Senate hallway where she had been called angry for demanding answers. It was in the trembling voice of a mother from Detroit who had begged her, sobbing to investigate her son's death, only to be told later by a senior colleague, "Don't waste your career on ghosts." Her pupils dilated. The applause faded into static. All she could see now was that crucifix, the same shape, the same size, as the one from a night she never wanted to speak of again. Steve leaned forward, still smiling, unaware. "Jasmine, welcome. We've been waiting for this moment." But Jasmine Crockett, the fighter, the flame, the name that kept senators up at night. She blinked slowly and smiled with grace, because something ancient had just stirred within her. And this was no longer just an interview. This was going to be a reckoning. And that crucifix, silent, still, gleaming faintly in the studio lights, didn't just catch her eye. It struck her like lightning held in silver. Jasmine blinked, but what she saw wasn't the stage, wasn't the crowd, wasn't even Steve. It was the cold tile of a bathroom floor in a DC apartment, the distant wail of sirens outside, and the unbearable stillness inside her chest. In that one glance, the stage became a battleground she'd already survived. She straightened just enough to mask the quake in her breath, but something inside had shifted, snapped perhaps, the way glass doesn't shatter all at once, but from a single, perfect crack. Steve, oblivious to the war unfolding 2 feet away, smiled warmly and leaned into his next question. "So let's talk politics," he said, voice textured with curiosity. "You've clashed with governors, taken on billionaires, and stood your ground against Supreme Court justices. What keeps you going?" Jasmine blinked once. Not from nerves, but calculation. How much could she say without burning every bridge behind her? She gave the expected answer, but her tone was anything but rehearsed. "Justice doesn't wait for comfort," she said, gaze locked. "It doesn't care if the room likes you. It cares if you show up anyway." The audience murmured in appreciation, but Jasmine didn't look at them. Her eyes were fixed on Steve's, or rather the space just below his collarbone. Her voice remained calm, but every syllable carried the weight of years. "I've walked into rooms where I wasn't just underestimated, I was unwelcome. I've had microphones cut, cameras pulled, notes stolen. I've had colleagues call me too emotional when I named murder for what it was. Her fingers tightened in her lap. I've left hearings with handprints on my soul. Steve lowered his question card, the smile fading. He knew this wasn't the answer he had prepared for, and Jasmine wasn't done. Then silence. Not the kind that makes space for laughter, the kind that makes space for confession. But today, she said, and her voice did something it hadn't done all evening. It trembled, just slightly, like a bell struck from within. I didn't come here to talk about legislation, or filibusters, or bills that die on purpose. She paused, a long pause, one breath, two. Her jaw set, but her eyes had softened in a way that made the entire room hold its breath. I came here to say thank you. 1,000 camera lenses blinked. Steve leaned forward, quiet now, brows knitting in curiosity. Thank who? He asked gently, the light catching again on that crucifix. Jasmine's voice dropped to a whisper, but somehow it hit harder than anything she'd shouted in Congress. You, she said, thank you, for something you once said that I wasn't supposed to hear, but I did, and it saved me. The moment after her words landed was so still, it felt like the entire room forgot how to breathe. The tension didn't dissipate, it crystallized, the way glass fogs just before it shatters. Jasmine sat motionless, her hands folded tightly, knuckles pale, as if they were the last barrier holding something volcanic inside her chest. Steve's expression had changed. He wasn't the host anymore. He was the witness. Jasmine didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. When truth walks into the room wearing scars, it doesn't need to shout. People think justice is elegant, she began, her tone sharp but unbearably composed. They think it's speeches and photo ops, tweets and triumphs. She turned her head slowly toward the audience. They never see the battlefield behind the podium. I've gotten letters, real letters, folded neat, postmarked, and filled with venom, she continued, her eyes narrowing like someone who'd memorized every threat word for word. Watch your back, you dirty fraud. Go back where you came from. We see you, and we're coming. Her voice didn't shake. That made it worse. I've opened my inbox and found pictures of lynching victims, with my name photoshopped in. Gasps rippled through the room, but Jasmine didn't blink. They put them under fake names, but they use real addresses, my family's addresses. Her fingers twitched in her lap. One night I had to leave through the back of my office because someone posted my location live and tagged it. Easy target. She let those words settle, like ash falling in a burned-out field. And then there's the quiet knives, she added, her voice dipping lower. The ones that smile when they cut you. She looked up, locking eyes with Steve now, not in confrontation but confession. I've had fellow lawmakers leak false stories about me to the press, then come hug me on the House floor like nothing happened. I've had staffers accidentally delete reports from my office drives. I've had donors call me a problem behind closed doors because I refuse to be palatable. Her voice tightened with cold precision. They don't want you to speak. They want you to smile. Say the right things. Take the photo. Sign the bill. But don't feel. Don't grieve. Don't bleed. The silence grew unbearable, but Jasmine leaned into it like it was a pulpit. I stand up every day for those who've been silenced, she said, a flicker of something ancient behind her voice now. For mothers who buried sons with no justice, for children who study in classrooms with no heat and no hope, for communities that exist in the margins because power refuses to draw them a map. She paused not for drama, but because her breath caught, and she let it. But sometimes, after I've spent the day screaming for others, I come home and realize I've got nothing left for me. Her voice dropped to a whisper now, but somehow it carried farther. No prayers, no words, not even my own name. And then, after a heartbeat so loud it seemed to echo through the lights and cameras, she said it. That's the part they never show. The cost of being a voice when no one ever checks if you still have one. And after everything she had exposed, the calculated cruelty, the psychological warfare masked as politics, There was still one truth she hadn't touched. The room waited, unknowingly poised at the edge of something irreversible. Jasmine leaned forward slightly, as if the words she was about to speak came not from memory, but from an old wound that had never quite closed. Her voice dropped an octave, slower now, measured. Not from uncertainty, but from reverence. "You want to know the truth?" she said. "The one I never wrote in any op-ed, never said on the floor of Congress?" She paused just long enough for the silence to lean in. "There was a night," she began, "when I didn't think I would survive my own purpose." Her hands remained still, but her chest rose with a breath that felt earned, not automatic. "It was after a hearing on qualified immunity," she continued, the words tasting like metal. "I sat there for hours being talked over, mocked, by men who hadn't buried children from their districts, hadn't held grieving mothers, hadn't seen the autopsy photos I had memorized." Her eyes glazed, not from tears, but distance. "I read names of black boys who never made it to high school. And when I was done, one senator looked me in the eye and said, 'Thank you for your performance.'" Her lip curled, not in anger, in exhaustion. "I walked out, didn't go to my office, didn't speak to staff, just grabbed my keys and drove." Her voice hardened into steel wrapped in velvet. "No destination, just motion, just silence, just headlights and the sound of my own heart, which by that point felt more like a metronome ticking down to something I couldn't name." She looked past the audience now as if speaking to the road itself. "I drove for 3 hours, through toll booths I don't remember passing, past exits I didn't read. I wasn't running from danger. I was running from the voice in my head that kept asking, 'Are you still making a difference? Or are you just bleeding in public for applause?'" Her fingers slowly intertwined. "When I got home, I didn't go to bed. I sat on the kitchen floor, in full suit, heels still on, my knees against the cabinets, my back against the fridge like I was bracing for some invisible impact. The stillness in the room wasn't dramatic. It was sacred. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't move. Just sat there while the streetlight outside blinked through the window like some lazy heartbeat." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Then I did the thing that scared me most. I started writing goodbye. A beat. To my mother." She looked down at her lap, jaw tight. "I told her I was sorry. Sorry for raising a daughter who only ever knew how to fight and didn't know how to stop." Her eyes lifted, empty now, like the aftershock of grief. "I told her I was tired, not just in the body, in the soul." And then, with a voice no louder than the rustle of breath, she said the words that cracked the air in half. "My phone fell out of my coat pocket, hit the floor, the screen lit up, just for a second." She inhaled, her throat quivering. That was the only light in the room. And just when the weight of the silence felt final, when the cold from the tile beneath her had numbed her legs, and the thoughts circling her mind had turned from sharp to empty, something happened. A dim pulse of light blinked against the kitchen cabinet like a whisper in a locked room. Jasmine didn't move. Her hands were still clenched in her lap, her breath barely rising. But her eyes shifted. The screen of her phone, still cracked from a fall months earlier, flickered to life, casting a pale glow across the room. No text, no call, just an algorithm's random mercy. YouTube, mid-autoplay, a shaky recording, low resolution, a dark stage, and then his voice. The room didn't change, but the air inside her did. Steve Harvey appeared on that tiny screen, barely lit by a lone spotlight above him. He wasn't performing. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't telling jokes. He stood like a man carrying something holy, one hand gripping the mic, the other pressed over his chest as if holding a wound. And then he spoke. Not to the audience in that room, not to the internet, not to the thousands who might stumble across the clip someday, but somehow, impossibly, directly to her. "If you're at the lowest point in your life," his voice rang out, low and solemn, "don't go any lower. Don't dig. Don't sink. Just stay still." Jasmine stared, paralyzed. "Because maybe," he continued, "what you're standing in isn't a grave. Maybe it's a foundation. Maybe God is laying stone beneath you, So one day you can rise on something that holds. Her mouth parted slightly, breath caught in her throat like glass. She didn't speak. She didn't cry. Not yet. She simply replayed it. Once, twice, 3 times. And each time the same thing happened. That sentence carved through the darkness like a blade of light. She had heard 1,000 speeches, given hundreds, but nothing had ever spoken to her need. Not like this. Not at that exact second. On the third replay, her shoulders trembled. One tear fell, then another. Not from despair, from recognition, from the unbearable sacred realization that someone she had never met had thrown her a rope in the very moment she had planned to let go. I wasn't looking for hope, she whispered, voice raw, stripped of armor. I was looking for an exit. Her eyes stayed locked on the screen. But those words gave me something even more terrifying than peace. They gave me pause. She swallowed, shaking her head slowly. And in that pause, I waited. She looked up then, locking eyes with Steve Harvey for the first time since she'd begun the story. And the next morning, I was still here. And as the final syllables escaped Jasmine's lips, the next morning, I was still here. A silence heavier than any applause settled over the room. No cameras moved. No audience members shifted. Time itself seemed to pause, as if the studio lights had dimmed in reverence for a truth too sacred to interrupt. Across from her, Steve Harvey sat paralyzed, not by shock, but by something more profound, revelation. The kind of revelation that pulls guilt from places you didn't know you carried, that floods your chest with questions you don't know how to answer. His body didn't move, but his breathing changed. Shallow now, almost imperceptible. The show, the stage, the schedule, all of it collapsed under the weight of what had just been said. Then slowly, like gravity had increased tenfold, Steve's right hand rose. Not for dramatic effect, not for television. It was instinct, pure, ancient, unfiltered. He reached for the crucifix that hung just beneath the fold of his lapel, the one that had become part of his public image, but had once been chosen in private desperation. His fingers curled around it, not like a man clutching a symbol, but like someone reaching for the only part of themselves still standing. The metal was warm from his skin, but it may as well have been fire. He bowed his head slightly, eyes no longer able to hold the weight of hers. A single tear broke free and slipped down his cheek. His voice, when it finally emerged, was fractured and faint. "I was just talking," he said, barely audible. "I was just trying to speak from the heart." He paused, breath stalling in his chest. "I didn't know it reached you." The words hung in the space between them, like a confession that had waited years to be spoken aloud. And in that moment, not a single camera, not a single spotlight could distract from what was happening. Steve Harvey, a man who had held the world's laughter in the palm of his hand, now sat speechless, humbled, hunted by grace, because what Jasmine had handed him wasn't gratitude. It was something far heavier. Proof. Proof that words matter. That even unplanned honesty could carve footholds into the lives of people who were slipping. He looked down at the cross again, hands still clenched around it like a man trying to make sense of his own role in a miracle. His lips trembled, but he did not cry for show. He cried because somewhere deep in the past, he had said something he thought would be forgotten. And today it stood in front of him, breathing. Jasmine didn't rush to fill the silence. She let it live, because she understood its purpose. Then gently, deliberately, she lifted her own hand and placed it over her chest. Her fingers splayed across her heart as if anchoring herself to the moment. Her voice, when it returned, had no quiver, only depth. "That's why it saved me," she said softly but with piercing clarity. "Because you didn't say it for applause. You didn't package it for inspiration. You weren't performing." She leaned in just slightly, not confrontational, but intimate. "You didn't know anyone was listening, and that's what made it real." Steve's eyes lifted then, slowly, and what he saw was not a congresswoman, not a political figure, not a guest on a talk show. He saw someone he had unknowingly pulled back from the edge with a few unrehearsed, soul-born words. His jaw tightened. A muscle in his cheek twitched. But still, he said nothing. Because what could you possibly say to someone who just told you that your words interrupted a suicide note? Jasmine continued, her voice rich now, with both tenderness and devastation. We live in a world where people monetize pain, Steve, where they weaponize faith, package trauma, turn suffering into content. Her hand pressed harder against her chest. But that night, what you said wasn't content. It wasn't a clip. It wasn't entertainment. She paused, letting her breath settle. It was a lifeline, thrown into the dark. No aim, no target, just honest, just true. And somehow, it found me. The camera operators, trained professionals with years of live television under their belts, found their hands trembling behind the lens. Because what they were capturing wasn't a segment. It was testimony. Steve blinked once, and then again, as if trying to clear the fog from his vision, as if trying to unfeel something already embedded in his chest. His grip on the cross hadn't loosened. If anything, it had grown tighter, like he finally realized what he'd been wearing all these years. I didn't think it would matter, he whispered, more to himself than to her. It was just a moment. I didn't plan it, I just felt it, and I said it. Jasmine nodded. Exactly, she said, eyes steady, unsparing. That's why it broke through. Then her voice dropped, so low only he in the silence could truly hear it. You weren't trying to save anyone. A beat. And that's exactly why you did. Her words pierced like scripture, not because they were loud, but because they were earned. There was no theater in her tone, no performance in her gaze. Just truth, undressed, unprotected, unafraid. And in that moment, two lives once separated by platform, industry, and purpose were tied together by something infinitely rarer. Unintended salvation. Steve let go of the crucifix finally, slowly, almost reluctantly, like parting with something newly understood. His hand dropped back into his lap, but the weight remained. He opened his mouth as if to respond, then closed it again. Not because he lacked the words, but because there were none adequate. Not yet. What he had offered the world had boomeranged back to him in the form of survival. And what Jasmine had just done was more than acknowledge it. She had sanctified it. And as the crucifix fell gently against Steve's chest, as the weight of unintended salvation wrapped the room in silence, Jasmine inhaled. Not because it was easy, but because what she was about to say had never been said out loud before. Not on any stage, not in any chamber, not even in the solitude of her own home. Her voice, when it returned, carried something different now. Not just pain, but origin. And like a river forced underground, it rose from a place deeper than memory. People always ask me why I got into politics, she began, her tone low, eyes drifting beyond the cameras. Some think it's ambition, others say it's fire, maybe anger. She let the words hang, then looked back at Steve with a stillness so sharp it cut the air. But the truth is, I didn't choose this fight. It chose me the day the system chose to take my sister. A hush moved through the studio, not from drama, but grief recognizing its own. Her name was Aaliyah, Jasmine said, and even saying it cracked something ancient inside her. 17 years old, brilliant, kind, soft-spoken until she laughed. And when she laughed, the whole block smiled. She smiled faintly at the memory, but it died in an instant. She was walking home from tutoring, headphones in, hoodie up. It was cold that night, and the patrol car said she matched the description. Jasmine's voice remained steady, but her hands now clutched each other so tightly her knuckles blanched. The officer said she moved too fast, then said she didn't move fast enough, said she reached, said she was a threat. Her breath hitched, only once, before she forced it still again. What she reached for was her phone. What she got was a bullet to the chest. A gasp moved through the audience, but Jasmine didn't blink. I was on the phone with her when it happened, she said. I heard the shout, then the thud, then nothing. Her eyes burned, but she refused to look away. They put her in a plastic bag before I got to the hospital, treated her like evidence, like a threat that needed zipping up and filing away. Jasmine's voice was now edged with iron. They said it was a tragic misunderstanding. They said it was protocol. They said, these things happen. Her jaw locked. And that was the moment I understood. The system wasn't broken. It was functioning exactly as it was designed to. Steve's lips parted slightly, but no sound came out. He was no longer a host. He was a mourner. I held her, Steve, Jasmine continued, softer now but more dangerous for it. Her body was still warm, and I remember whispering into her hair, I swear to God, they will hear your name in every chamber I enter. She paused, a breath that sounded like it had been buried with Aaliyah, and I kept that promise. I ran for office with her obituary in my hand. I walked into Congress carrying her photo in my bag. Her voice now rose, not in volume, but in gravity. But I didn't walk in to make friends. I walked in to make noise. And the minute I did, the machine turned on me. She leaned in now, eyes blazing with a clarity that was both righteous and weary. They let me run, sure. But once I got there, they started trimming pieces of me off like I was too loud to belong. Her voice cracked, not in weakness, but in worn-out war. They told me to smile more, to soften my language, to stop making white men uncomfortable in hearings, to be less confrontational when reading the names of the dead. Her lips curled, not in anger, but in disbelief. I would speak truth into a microphone, and the network would clip my sentences, splice them out of context, turn my sister's memory into a headline, a beat. They tried to make me forget why I walked in that building in the first place. The room tightened with a silence that felt like mourning. And some days, I almost did, she admitted, eyes glossing. Some days I'd sit in my car after a hearing, after being talked over, ignored, reduced, and I'd wonder if I was making any difference at all. She looked at Steve, and her next words came like a breath she'd been holding for years. Because that's what the system does best. It doesn't always kill you with bullets. Sometimes it kills you with doubt. Her voice trembled now, but not from breaking, from carrying too much weight for too long. It makes you question your volume, your presence, your right to still be. Steve reached slightly forward in his seat, visibly struggling with what to say, his crucifix still hanging limp over his chest like a burden finally recognized. But Jasmine kept going. She had to. My sister's death made me pick up the sword, she said. But Steve, your words, that night on that tiny screen, they kept me from laying it down. Her voice dropped into a whisper, but it echoed like thunder. I was already bleeding in the arena. But that sentence, your sentence, reminded me why I walked in covered in scars to begin with. Then, with eyes sharp as her memory and voice steady as her grief, she finished the truth that no one had ever heard from her before. Aaliyah's death was the reason I started fighting. She paused, let the ache breathe. But you, Steve Harvey, you were the reason I kept fighting. No music, no applause, just silence. Holy, shattered, unforgettable. And as the echo of Jasmine's final confession hung between them, you were the reason I kept fighting. Steve Harvey didn't speak. He simply looked at her the way a man looks at a burning building from which someone just walked out alive. No applause, no camera shift. Just the holy weight of two lives that had collided in silence long before this night. Then, after what felt like minutes suspended in reverence, he leaned forward. Not as a host, not even as a friend, but as someone who had once waited in the dark himself. His voice came low, threaded with something deeper than empathy, something that had been earned through fire. Let me ask you something, he said gently, almost as if afraid the wrong words might reopen everything she'd just managed to close. Have you ever heard God in silence? Jasmine didn't answer at first. Her eyes lowered, but not to escape the question, only to search for it. The kind of search that doesn't begin in the head, but in the chest, where old pain never quite forgets how to echo. Her hands rested still, but her breath caught as if the question had pulled loose a memory buried too deeply for casual telling. When she looked up again, there was no defiance, no political fire, just something almost childlike in its naked truth. Yes, she said finally, and her voice had changed. Lower, slower. I have. Her lips parted again, but the words didn't come right away. They had to travel through something first. But it wasn't the kind of silence people think of when they pray. It wasn't soft. It wasn't sacred. It was hollow, deafening. The air in the studio thickened, not with tension, but with awe. I sat in that kitchen, she said, and I remember thinking, so this is what the end sounds like. Not a scream, not a cry, just nothing. Just silence so loud it presses on your chest until it steals your name. Her fingers curled slightly into the fabric of her skirt. And in that moment, I wasn't reaching for God. I wasn't calling out. I didn't have the strength. Her eyes flickered toward Steve again. I didn't even think he was watching. She let out a breath that seemed to rattle loose from her ribs. And then, the screen lit up. There was no need to say whose voice was on that screen. Everyone in the room already knew. It wasn't dramatic, she continued. No angelic choir, no thunder, just a tired video on my cracked phone. Your voice, grainy, low, real. Her words began to tremble, not from performance, but from the weight of memory becoming sound again. You said, if you're at the bottom of your life, don't jump. Just stay still. Maybe that's not a grave. Maybe it's the foundation God is laying to lift you up. A shudder ran through her shoulders. And Steve, that sentence broke through something I didn't even know had solidified around my heart. She paused, her hands now covering her sternum, not for drama, but because the ache had returned, and this time she wasn't pushing it away. I didn't hear a voice from heaven. I heard yours. I didn't feel a miracle. I felt presence. She nodded slowly, as if confirming it to herself, even as she said it aloud. And for the first time in weeks, the silence wasn't my enemy. It was the place where I realized God hadn't abandoned me. He was just waiting for me to be still long enough to hear something different. Her eyes shimmered, but no tears fell. I'd spent my whole life speaking for others, fighting, defending, shouting. But that night, for the first time, I heard something speak for me. Steve didn't move, didn't shift. His crucifix glinted once more beneath the lights, but he made no attempt to reach for it. Instead, he simply listened the way the broken always do, without blinking. Sometimes, Jasmine whispered, God doesn't shout over the storm. He just sits with you in the wreckage until you can breathe again. A breath. And sometimes, he uses people who don't know they're being used. Her voice sharpened, like steel emerging from soft cloth. You weren't preaching, Steve. You weren't trying to save anyone. But that is what made it holy. Because grace that isn't performed is the only kind that truly heals. Then came the sentence that didn't rise in volume, but in force. An emotional crescendo hidden inside a whisper. That night I realized, God is never late. He just shows up in ways we're too wounded to expect. And with those final words, the studio didn't erupt. It held still, held breath, held space. Because in that moment, two people understood something that cameras could never capture. God doesn't always speak through prophets. Sometimes he speaks through the wounded. And sometimes the voice that saves you doesn't even know you're listening. And as the last word left Jasmine's lips, God just shows up in ways we're too wounded to expect. The air in the studio became sacred. Not silent, sacred. The kind of stillness not born from absence, but from awe. No one clapped. No one moved. The camera operators behind the lenses weren't technicians anymore. They were witnesses. And in the center of that quiet battlefield of truth and breath, Steve Harvey sat still as stone, staring into Jasmine's eyes with something between reverence and ruin. The crucifix on his chest, once just a detail, now glinted like a burden newly understood. His face, once trained to balance gravity with levity, was undone. Not performative, not stylized, but raw, like someone remembering a prayer they didn't know they'd said. His hand slowly moved toward his chest again, almost involuntarily, and closed around the small silver cross. But this time it wasn't instinct, it was recognition. Recognition of the fact that something he said, once casually, unscripted, had echoed in the heart of someone sitting on the edge of ending everything. Jasmine had just told him that his words, spoken without knowing their destination, had reached into a night soaked in despair and whispered, "Not yet." His fingers curled tighter around the cross. He didn't look at the cameras. He didn't try to respond. His breath stalled somewhere between his lungs and his throat, like his soul had frozen mid-exhale. Then quietly, like he was afraid to break something sacred between them, he said, "I was just trying to tell the truth that night." A pause. "I didn't think anyone would remember it." He swallowed hard, lips parting again. "I sure didn't think someone would be holding on to it like that." His eyes shimmered. "I wasn't trying to be anything." Jasmine heard the sentence falter, and in that moment, she understood something with crystalline clarity. The very man who had saved her didn't believe he had the right to be called a savior. She reached out, not impulsively, but with the slow gravity of someone handing something sacred. Her hand moved across the space between their chairs and landed gently, purposefully, on Steve's. He didn't pull away. He didn't flinch. He looked down at their joined hands like a truth he had never asked for had just landed in his palm. She let her hand close around his, not as a gesture of comfort, but as confirmation. The contact wasn't warm, it was electric. Something eternal moved through the moment, slow and pulsing, like grace had decided to manifest in skin and trembling fingers. Then Jasmine spoke, not to the room, not to the audience, not to the world, just to him. "You think you're just a storyteller," she said, voice low but charged like thunder beneath velvet. "But you're not." Her grip tightened, just slightly, anchoring him to the truth he had refused to claim. "You're a messenger, a vessel, a man who plants faith without needing a steeple or a robe or a pulpit." She leaned forward, her eyes never leaving his. "You've been preaching to the broken without ever wearing the title, and you don't even know you've been walking in ministry your whole life." Steve's lips quivered. His jaw clenched as he tried, desperately, to hold himself together. But it was too late. The wall cracked, then shattered. His shoulders trembled, just once, and a single tear slid down the side of his face. Still, he didn't let go of her hand. If anything, his fingers closed tighter around hers like someone grabbing the ledge before falling. "I never thought I was good enough for that," he said, voice fractured. "I mean, I've done some things, Jasmine. I've failed big. I've fallen hard. I've doubted loud. I've walked away from God more times than I can count." He blinked rapidly, trying to control what no longer could be contained. "I've cursed the heavens. I've begged for answers that never came. I've questioned everything." His voice cracked. "So I figured if God ever needed someone to do something holy, he'd pick someone who wasn't so dented." The vulnerability was so raw it hurt to witness. But Jasmine didn't flinch. She leaned closer. Her eyes didn't soften. They sharpened. Not in judgment, but in conviction. And when she spoke again, it came like the voice of fire in a burning bush. Not loud, but inescapably true. "That's exactly why he chose you," she said. The sentence landed like prophecy, vibrating in the silence around them. "Because you didn't try to look the part. Because you weren't rehearsed. Because your flaws made room for other people to feel human again." She pulled her hand back, just slightly, then laid it over her own heart. "Steve, we live in a world that worships polish, platforms, perfection. But God doesn't use perfection. He uses pain." She let the words breathe. "And he doesn't trust the ones who chase titles. He trusts the ones who carry scars." Steve's eyes widened, tears spilling freely now. Jasmine nodded as if sealing something invisible between them. "You didn't save me because you were trying to. You saved me because you weren't." Her voice broke, just a hair, and that made it even more dangerous. "That night, you weren't on a mission. You weren't following a script. You were just speaking from a place you thought no one would hear. But I did." She paused, and when she spoke again, it was with the authority of someone who had earned every syllable. "And that unintentional truth, that unrehearsed honesty, is why I'm alive." She let go of his hand then, not because the moment had passed, but because what needed to be given had already been delivered. Steve slowly leaned back, wiping a hand across his face, breathing like someone who had just escaped drowning without knowing they were underwater. He looked at her, not with disbelief, but with something quieter, something holy, something like surrender. A moment passed, then another, and finally Steve whispered the question, not to break the silence, but to honor it. Why me? It wasn't rhetorical. It wasn't dramatic. It was the quiet scream of a man who had just realized he had been walking with purpose on a road he thought was random. Jasmine didn't hesitate. She leaned forward once more, her voice gentler now, but no less lethal. "Because you never claimed the spotlight," she said. "Because you made space for someone like me to hear God in the static. Because when no one else came, your voice did." She placed her hand back over her chest, over the place where her grief once drowned her. "You didn't know it. You weren't aiming, but you reached me." A pause. "And Steve, maybe that's the most divine thing of all, being used without knowing it." He said nothing. He couldn't. He simply looked at her as a man who had spent his life telling jokes, giving advice, offering encouragement. Now finally seeing, that somewhere along the way, those words had been doing more than landing. They had been lifting. And Jasmine, still steady, still rooted, gave him the only truth that mattered now. "Steve," she said softly, "you thought you were just telling stories, but to someone barely holding on, you were speaking life." And in the heavy, aching stillness that followed, Steve Harvey, man of comedy, of culture, of cameras, closed his eyes, bowed his head, and let the revelation settle over him like rain on dry ground. He had never called himself a preacher, but heaven had. And as Jasmine's voice dissolved into the silence she had so powerfully claimed, "You were speaking life," a shift occurred. Not on stage, not in the script, but in the spirit of everyone present. The atmosphere no longer felt like a studio. It felt like a sanctuary, the kind of place where words weren't just heard, they were received, where pain became currency and testimony became a sacred exchange. The spotlights overhead seemed to retreat, not in brightness, but in reverence. Like even the equipment knew this wasn't performance anymore. This was something closer to revelation. Jasmine sat for just a moment longer, her hands resting in her lap, the very posture of a woman who had bled her truth into the open and now had nothing left to conceal. Her breathing was slow, purposeful, as if she were grounding herself in the weight of everything she had finally released. Then, without ceremony, without even the faintest tremble of hesitation, she stood, and the world stood with her. The audience didn't move, but somehow their stillness rose with her, as though every person in the room had just watched someone walk out of their own grave. Her heels tapped gently against the stage as she turned to face Steve, who was still seated, head bowed, hand gripping the cross on his chest like a man anchoring himself to something he only now understood had been keeping him afloat all along. He wasn't wiping his tears. He wasn't performing resolve. He was processing. And not the surface kind of processing that happens in interviews when someone needs a beat to think of a witty line. No, this was soul-deep, marrow-level awakening. Then Steve slowly, deliberately rose to his feet. But he didn't rise like a celebrity returning to the show. He rose like a man standing at an altar. His knees weren't weak, but they carried the weight of understanding. Understanding that something had just happened that could not be undone, unseen, or unfelt. He looked at Jasmine, and in his eyes was the expression of a man who had finally met the consequence of his own obedience. The obedience of speaking one sentence on one stage on one night, and learning that sentence had kept someone from stepping into forever. The studio was silent, not empty, not quiet, sacred. Even the cameras seemed unsure whether they should keep rolling, as if the technology was too modern, too crude to capture what now lived between them. Jasmine faced Steve fully. The air between them felt electric, but not tense, charged. Charged with everything that had been spoken, everything that had been carried, everything that had finally been seen. Her voice came again, But this time it didn't need strength to command. It had earned authority through vulnerability. She spoke with the voice of a woman who had carried a coffin in her chest for years, and now finally was lowering it into the ground. "Steve," she said, and even the way she said his name was a benediction. "You thought you were just telling stories." Her words didn't fall. They landed, solid, undeniable. But to someone sitting alone, drowning in silence, you were speaking life. He blinked, lips parted slightly, but still unable to respond. His eyes shimmered, not from emotion he was trying to hide, but from emotion he finally had permission to feel. Jasmine took a step closer, not for drama, not for attention, just enough to close the distance of a revelation. "You taught me something I never read in law school, never heard in church, never found in any speech I ever gave," she continued. "You taught me that sometimes salvation doesn't come from scripture. It doesn't arrive in thunder. It doesn't wear robes or stand behind podiums." She took one more step, and now they stood face to face. No politics, no television, just one saved soul and one man who didn't know he was a savior. "Sometimes," she said, her voice trembling with the beauty of its own truth, "salvation comes from a real person, a man who never asked to be holy, a man just trying to live right. Speak truth. Hold on. Wake up one more day." Her hands, slow and steady, lifted between them, hovering for a second in the space between his chest and hers. And then she touched his heart, not roughly, not theatrically, just placed her palm over his chest, right above the crucifix he had clutched all evening. Her hand wasn't a gesture. It was a recognition. "You don't need a church to carry the word," she whispered. Steve's eyes closed, not to retreat, but to let the weight of it all settle in his bones. Tears spilled freely down his cheeks now, not born of sadness, but of knowing. Knowing that he had been entrusted with something divine without ever being told. Knowing that he had been a vessel, a lifeline, a whisper from God on a night when someone else had been begging for silence to end them. He opened his mouth, but only one sound came out, a single broken breath. It was Jasmine who filled the air again. "But you know what moved me most?" she asked, pulling her hand back, voice steadier now. "It wasn't what you said. It was that you didn't even know you were saving someone. That's why it hit so hard. That's why it reached me." She stepped back, just half a pace, but enough to let the final words live in their own gravity. "Because you weren't trying to be the light, and that's what made you shine." Steve looked at her, fully looked, and when he finally nodded, slow and tear-soaked, he said nothing. Not because he had nothing to offer, but because sometimes surrender is louder than any sentence. And as that nod hung in the air, the audience, who had remained motionless for what felt like an eternity, still didn't move, because they knew what they had witnessed was not entertainment. It wasn't scripted, it wasn't rehearsed, it was a miracle in plain clothes. Jasmine exhaled slowly, her chest rising with a peace that had been years in the making. She looked at Steve one last time, eyes no longer heavy with memory, but glowing with clarity. "You reminded me," she said, her voice softer than ever, but no less commanding, "that faith doesn't always look like a sermon." Her hands returned to her sides. "Sometimes it looks like a man," she finished, "just doing his best, and doing it loud enough for God to slip through the cracks." And Steve, his body trembling, his soul wide open, didn't answer. He simply stood there, tears falling, heart open, finally understanding what it meant to sow something divine, without ever knowing he was the sower. And as the final tear slid down Steve's cheek, and Jasmine's voice faded into a silence louder than applause, one truth remained suspended in the room like smoke from a long-burning fire. This moment wasn't just about two lives intersecting. It was about something deeper, what it means to matter in a world that forgets people every single day. The lesson didn't come wrapped in applause. It came wrapped in scars. Scars that Jasmine carried not on her skin, but in her voice, in the way it trembled and held firm all at once. You could see it in her eyes. The exhaustion of being called strong just because she survived what should have killed her spirit. You could feel it in her breath, the ache of fighting battles she never started but was born into. The world doesn't hand out medals to women like her. It hands out microphones, and then cuts the feed when she speaks too loud. It offers seats at the table, then moves the table when she arrives. And yet she showed up, again, and again, and again. Not because she was invincible, but because she knew someone had to speak when the world turned its back. That's the thing about injustice. It doesn't always scream. Sometimes it whispers behind closed doors. Sometimes it stamps "denied" on a piece of paper with no explanation. Sometimes it looks like a committee adjourning just before your bill is heard. Sometimes it sounds like your name being mispronounced in rooms where everyone knows exactly who you are. Jasmine didn't become a fighter because she wanted to. She became one because silence was lethal. Because if she didn't name what was killing her people, the system would keep burying them without ever writing it down. But that night with Steve Harvey taught her something else, something more dangerous, more sacred. That sometimes it's not the power in the pulpit, the vote in the chamber, or the protest in the street that saves lives. Sometimes it's a single sentence, said by someone who didn't know they were being watched, by someone who wasn't trying to lead, just trying to live right. And in that revelation came the most human lesson of all. You never know when your ordinary might be someone else's miracle. Jasmine had faced bullets in the form of words. "You're too emotional. You're a race baiter. You're making this political." She'd been reduced to headlines and hate mail, turned into a symbol people could attack without ever learning her story. But Steve, he reminded her, no, proved to her that humanity was still possible, that somewhere beneath the algorithms and debates, someone could still speak truth without needing a platform, a party, or permission. And that's the paradox of faith and survival. The people who've been broken the most often carry the healing. That video Steve had recorded, it wasn't a sermon, it wasn't polished. The mic crackled, the camera shook. He stumbled over a line. And yet, it reached her more deeply than any law ever had. Why? Because it was real. Because it wasn't trying to convince, it was just trying to tell the truth. And in a world addicted to noise, to spectacle, to control, that kind of truth is revolutionary. Jasmine realized, standing there beside him, that we've forgotten what power actually looks like. It's not always in the suit. It's not in the viral clip. It's not in the crowd. Sometimes it's in the whisper someone hears in their loneliest hour and never forgets. Sometimes it's in a stranger's voice saying, "Don't give up," and not for likes, not for clout, just because it's right. That is what makes the lesson unforgettable. We are responsible for one another in ways we may never see. The cashier who smiles when no one else does, the teacher who stays behind after class, the father who says, "I'm proud of you," and doesn't realize that sentence will carry a child for 10 more years. The host who speaks from his gut just once and saves a congresswoman he's never met. It's not about being perfect. It's about being present. And Jasmine had spent so long trying to be perfect, measured, articulate, unshakable, that she forgot. The presence of someone who speaks truth from the gut, that is what liberates people. So when she looked at Steve that night, tears in both their eyes, she didn't see a man who had stumbled into greatness. She saw a man who had been trusted with it. And that leads to the deeper injustice the world never warns you about. The system doesn't just rob the voiceless, it also robs the unknowing heroes. People like Steve, who've been led to believe they're just entertainers, just employees, just ordinary. But Jasmine knew better. He was a living reminder that divine assignments don't come with business cards. The world had taught Jasmine to see salvation as something institutional, legislative, historical. She thought justice would come from courtrooms and cameras. But on the night she almost ended it all, the Constitution didn't save her. The Bible didn't leap from the shelf. The phone didn't ring. A grainy video with Steve Harvey's voice did. And the lesson was brutal and beautiful. You don't have to be famous to be holy. You just have to show up, speak truth, and not look away. Jasmine had seen the ugliest parts of America, the part that punishes you for surviving, the part that applauds your pain but doesn't change the policies that caused it. She had seen how the powerful build walls and dare you to call them gates. And she had watched her sister be buried without justice, her name dragged in hearings where her life was summarized in a sentence. But this lesson, this human lesson, was different. It didn't scream. It didn't punish. It held her. Steve Harvey didn't mean to be a preacher that night. He meant to be honest. And honesty, in a world full of spin, is prophetic. So here it was. The thing Jasmine had fought through blood and breath to name. Salvation isn't distant. It's among us. Worn in flesh, spoken in passing, lived by people who don't even know they're lighting the path for someone else. And if Steve Harvey could do that for her, just by being real, then maybe, just maybe, the rest of us could do it too. Not with a sermon, not with a stage, but with presence, with courage, with a sentence said at the right time to the right soul. Because the truth is, we're all walking past people who are barely holding on. And every time we speak life, every time we choose kindness over convenience, every time we tell someone, you matter, even when they don't believe it themselves, we plant something holy, and long after we forget the moment, someone else might still be alive because of it. And so, as the dust settled, not in the studio, but in the hearts of everyone who had witnessed this collision of survival and grace, Jasmine knew she couldn't stop at testimony, because truth without movement is just a whisper waiting to die. So she stepped forward, not as a congresswoman, not as a survivor, but as a mirror, held up to a nation too comfortable with forgetting. Her voice, already etched with the tremble of memory, now rang with something sharper. Urgency. The kind that doesn't ask for your attention. It demands it. And when she spoke again, it wasn't just to Steve. It wasn't even to the studio audience. It was to every person watching, whether from a living room couch, a hospital bed, or a prison bunk they didn't deserve to be in. You heard my story, she said, but this ain't just mine. Her eyes scanned the room like searchlights looking for survivors. This is the story of the kid who gets up early to take 2 buses to a school with no heat, the mother working 3 jobs and still can't afford insulin for her son, the man with a felony from 20 years ago who still can't vote in a democracy he pays taxes to. Her voice rose not with anger, but with the rhythm of righteous fire. You want to know what injustice really looks like? It looks like calling people lazy when they're dying just trying to survive. It looks like praising resilience in communities you refuse to invest in. It looks like asking, why are they so angry? Instead of asking, why are they still being shot at, silenced, evicted, ignored? The air in the studio thickened, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. She took one sharp step forward, her heels striking the floor like a gavel. But here's the thing, we are not powerless. There was no applause, just electricity. We're told change is slow, that it takes time, that it's complicated. She leaned in, her tone cutting through the fog of complacency. But the truth is, change is deliberate. It's made. It's carved. It's forced into the world by people who refuse to sit still while others suffer. She raised her hand, not for drama, but to signal something sacred. So I'm not asking you to feel sorry for me. I'm not asking you to admire me. I'm asking you to join me. The crowd still didn't move, but their silence was no longer passive. It was readying itself. You've got a voice? Use it. You've got a platform? Risk it. You've got privilege? Leverage it. Then she paused because what came next wasn't just from her mind. It was from the part of her spirit that had walked through hell and come back louder. And if you feel like you've got nothing, if you feel invisible, if the world has told you you're too poor, too broken, too late, listen to me. Her hand now pressed to her own heart. You are exactly who this world needs. A murmur began to stir, low, quiet, like an orchestra tuning before a thunderclap. Because real change doesn't come from the top down, she said. It comes from the ground up, from the unheard, the unseen, the ones who weren't supposed to survive, but did. And now we stand with something the powerful fear more than protest. Her eyes locked with the camera, as if burning through the screen. We stand with truth. And when truth finds its voice, systems tremble. At that moment, Steve was silent, not out of awe, but out of alignment. He didn't move, didn't blink, because he knew, like everyone else in that room, this wasn't a speech, this was a summons. Jasmine took one final step toward center stage, toward the light, not to bask in it, but to bend it toward those still standing in the dark. Don't wait for the perfect moment, she said. Don't wait for someone to tell you you're qualified. Don't wait until it's easy or safe or popular. Now her voice broke, not in weakness, but from the weight of what had to be said. If I had waited for that, I wouldn't be standing here. I wouldn't be here. Silence again, holy, taut, reverent. Then she dropped her hand, letting the weight of her words do the final work. This isn't just a show. This isn't just a moment. This is a call. And you, every single one of you, has a role to play in answering it. The silence cracked open, not with applause, but with conviction. The kind that doesn't fade when the lights go down. The kind that lingers in your chest like a ticking clock, asking, what are you going to do now that you've heard the truth? Because this is no longer just Jasmine Crockett's fight. It's yours. It's ours. And it starts the moment you decide, I will not watch injustice and remain comfortable. I will not hear pain and remain quiet. I will not feel fear and remain still. It starts when you believe that small actions, truth spoken in private, courage shown in chaos, mercy offered in motion, can turn ordinary people into holy disruption. So wherever you are, stand up, speak louder, fight harder, hold someone, forgive yourself. Don't wait for the world to approve. Be the sentence someone else survives on. Just like Steve was, just like Jasmine became, just like you can be. Right now, right here, before the silence takes someone else. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.